Today on the Bourbon Bytes podcast, the world of whiskey is about to change forever because we've got a major legal ruling that could make home distilling possible. One of the biggest producers in the country is slowing things down, and Sazerac is making moves that could reshape the entire industry. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Bourbon Bytes podcast, whiskey news and reviews with a gaming twist. I'm your host, Clifton, and this is the week of Thursday, April 16th, 2026. We went from a very light couple weeks of whiskey news to a whole whammy of updates this week, so I'm going to try to distill it down into some bite-sized news for you, as well as a bite-sized review coming here at the end of the episode. So let's start with a big one. This is a major update to the world of home distilling in the U.S. The U.S. Appeals Court has declared a 158-year-old ban on home distilling unconstitutional. So this ban originates back in what was called the Reconstruction era of the U.S. And while it was intended to address liquor tax evasion, it actually reduced the tax revenue of spirits. In a U.S. Appeals Court ruling that came out last Friday, they say that this ban is an unnecessary and improper means for Congress to exercise its power to tax. Now, this ruling actually took place in New Orleans, and it was in favor of the nonprofit Hobby Distillers Association and 4 of its 1,300 members. Now, their major argument was people should be free to distill spirits at their home, whether it's a hobby or just for personal consumption. When this was passed back in 1868, which was shortly after the Civil War, violators could face up to 5 years in prison and a $10,000 fine if they were caught distilling at home. And they used the argument that Congress could criminalize virtually any in-home activity that might evade certain taxes, including things like remote work and home-based businesses. They're saying that distilling is basically in the same category as these. Now, the lawyer that was representing the Hobby Distillers Association, his name is Devin Watkins, and he said that the ruling was an important decision about the limits of federal power. But an even better quote, I think, Andrew Grossman, who argued the nonprofit's appeal, called the decision an important victory for individual liberty that allows the plaintiffs to pursue their passion to distill fine beverages in their homes, and I look forward to sampling their output. Now, this doesn't immediately mean that home distilling is now legal. It still has to go through, ultimately, the Supreme Court to make a decision. But this is something that I think is a huge win. I mean, people have been making beer at home and even wine at home for years. And I know that home distilling has always kind of been seen as taboo. You either had to make the argument, oh, I'm making gasoline for my lawnmower. It was one of the excuses I feel like I've heard people say. And, oh, it's just olive oil, things like that. But this is actually really exciting. Now, of course, this just includes personal consumption and hobby consumption. I don't think this is going to qualify someone to open up a home distillery and ship bottles around the country. That's a whole nother conversation. But for a hobbyist to really be able to craft their own distillate and age their whiskey and, enjoy it themselves and share it with some friends, I think that's actually really cool. And I look forward to a future where that's not frowned upon by the government. Now, on the flip side of that, one of the biggest whiskey producers in the country is hitting pause. So MGP Ingredients, or MGPI, or however you know them, MGP out of Indiana, one of the biggest distributors for non-distilling producers, is actually closing down operations at some of their distilleries. And this kind of hurts my heart a little bit. So starting on May 1st, they're going to pause distillery operations at Limestone Branch Distillery and Lux Row Distillery. I am a huge Lux Row Distillery fan, and I know when they were bought up by MGP a couple years ago, people had this, fear, like they're a new craft brand, like what is MGP going to do to it? And I was really hopeful that MGP was just going to continue to elevate and increase distribution of this brand. Now, unfortunately, we're seeing some of the side effects, not necessarily of being part of an acquisition, but the whiskey industry in general. I mean, we've been talking about it on this podcast, and I know several others as well, about how the whiskey or alcohol market in general is facing a pretty severe decline, especially with younger generations. They're going to other alternative substances rather than alcohol. And it's something that I think is just an inevitable change of things. But this is actually starting to affect me personally with this decision, because I really do love Lux Row and the stuff they've been putting out. Now, from my understanding, this just means they won't be distilling new whiskey at these locations. They say that their other operations, including warehousing, bottling, and visitor experiences, will remain active. So it sounds like they're just going to delay production until the inventory level supports the additional whiskey being made. Now, unfortunately, this will affect 33 employees. They will be laid off, unfortunately, due to this. I always hate to hear that. I wish that they would find other roles for these people during these times versus, getting rid of them. I think, especially with only 33 people affected, I think that they could find something for them to do instead of laying them off. Fortunately, it does sound like they are not expecting this to affect the availability of their products. They just think they were overproducing for the future whiskey markets. Because again, whiskey's not made for current drinkers. It's being distilled for drinkers in 5, 6, 10 years down the road. If you don't expect the whiskey market to be as demanding as it is today, then of course, slow down your production. I just hate to see people lose their jobs over this. I wish they would partner with other distilleries maybe to move them over there if they can't afford to have them on their own. So bummer there, but yeah, I just wanted to report on that because that's a pretty big deal. Limestone Branch and Lux Row are just pretty significant parts of the Kentucky bourbon industry. They're not, no-name distilleries. I would say they're definitely lesser known than the big boys, but still, I'm a big fan of them. And then there's this, which might be the biggest long-term story of all. So Sazerac, who is the owner of Buffalo Trace and other major whiskey brands, is actually eyeing Jack Daniel's. They've been approaching Brown-Forman about purchasing out this distillery and brand. So previously, Pernod Ricard was looking at buying out Jack Daniel's, but now there's rumors that Sazerac is entering the picture as well. Now, there's some recent articles that include interviews with investors or people that are familiar to the matter, and they're still saying that they think the Pernod deal is more likely to go through because it's a better fit for the lineup. But it is interesting to see Sazerac make a play at this as well. And it's even more interesting because of the news story that I'm going to tell you following this. So stick around. I promise this is relevant. Sazerac actually just recently announced that they are opening their first Tennessee whiskey distillery. Yes, okay. See the connection there? So they say nearly a decade in the making, the new Tennessee whiskey is coming soon. So they say in this press release that I received from Sazerac that Sazerac's first Tennessee whiskey is preparing for a summer 2026 debut. So they are opening a Tennessee whiskey operation called A.J. Bond Distillery. And they're saying this is a major milestone as the company plans to debut its Tennessee whiskey this summer. They say that this name honors the bond between visionaries Alyssa Henley and the late John Lunn, who shared passion and decades of experience to help bring Sazerac's Tennessee whiskey ambitions to life. They say that the company first entered this category in 2016 with the acquisition of the Popcorn Sutton Distillery facility and retained the skilled production team that was led by Henley and Lunn. So, of course, Popcorn Sutton is a legendary figure in the world of moonshining, and he had a distilling operation in Tennessee that was purchased by Sazerac, apparently, back in 2016. So since that time, they have been making and aging their own Tennessee whiskey, and this is going to be a really big deal, and especially relevant because of the Jack Daniel's news situation. They say that this reflects Sazerac's broader vision to invest in exceptional people, places, and traditions that shape the future of American spirits. And Tennessee whiskey is no exception. Now, while there's not specific details about this flagship Tennessee whiskey coming from the A.J. Bond Distillery, this is a huge announcement because Sazerac's never really been involved in the Tennessee whiskey market. And now with them opening this distillery and having a big release this summer, it makes sense why they would look into the world of Jack Daniel's, and maybe they're planning to do a big Tennessee whiskey push. I think it just makes sense for them to maybe move into the Tennessee market. I'd be very curious to see how this A.J. Bond Distillery does. I'm very interested in trying the whiskey. I love trying new spirits from up-and-coming brands, and it sounds like the people behind this distillery have been working together for 20 years to help make this happen. So I'm excited to give it a try. I will let you know as soon as I hear more about that whiskey, because it's kind of a big deal. Now, I do have one final piece of news that ties in very nicely with our bite-sized review. So if you saw the title and the thumbnail of this, you know I'm reviewing the new Kentucky Senator Bourbon, but I actually just saw a press release go out this week that says the Kentucky Senator is partnering with the Permanently Disabled Jockeys Fund. So they are a 501c3 charity that provides financial assistance to more than 50 former jockeys who have suffered catastrophic on-track injuries. predominantly paralysis and or brain injuries. It was started back in 2006, and the fund has given them over $15 million. Well, they are partnering up with Kentucky Senator Bourbon for a new single-barrel bourbon that's going to be benefiting fallen riders. So they're saying that this is a 140-bottle single-barrel release that's part of this Kentucky Senator Jim Bunning release that we're about to review here shortly. But this is a single-barrel release of that product that is benefiting the people that were affected by injuries on the racetrack. Now, what's cool is this barrel was personally selected by current jockey Julien Leperreau, I think I'm pronouncing that right, PDJF President Joe Clables, and Kentucky Senator Bourbon founders Damon Thayer and Andre Rigard. Now, Leperreau is the winner of the 2026 George Wolfe Award, which recognizes the rider selected by his peers whose career and personal character exemplify excellence in the sport of thoroughbred horse racing. This limited single-barrel release is aged 8.5 years, just like the blend that we'll be trying here shortly, and it's going to be bottled at 126.4 proof. The mash bill of which is 75% corn, 21% rye, and 4% malted barley, and it's being aged at Bardstown Bourbon Company. Now, these go on sale on April 20th as part of the annual Frank and Dino's PDJF fundraiser. They're also going to be available to purchase at Frank and Dino's in Lexington and Blinker's Tavern in Covington. So I always think it's great to see a release like this being a tribute to an organization that I think many of us have never even thought of existing or needing to exist. This is great. I would love a chance to support this. Like I said, the one I'm reviewing today is just the batched version, but it's really cool to see that they did a special one-off single barrel release that was part of this blend specifically for that organization. Very, very cool. So hats off to those folks. But now I think it's time to get into our bite-sized review. All right, well, that news story gave us a little bit of a preview of this bourbon. This is the newest release of Kentucky Senator. This is release number 7, honoring Jim Bunning. By the way, I do want to mention that this bottle was sent to me by the folks at Kentucky Senator to give it a review, so huge shout out to that team. But what's really exciting is the bourbon is seriously good. I mean, 2 of these releases in the past have made my top 10 whiskeys. They are sourcing from various distilleries, so I never know what it's made up of, and I doubt these are very commonly the same mash bill. But it's always fun to try a new release, especially because this one's coming in at 8.5 years old. As with other releases, it's 107 proof. And all we know is it was bottled by Bardstown Bourbon Company. Now, what makes this release especially interesting is this is the exact same bourbon that was in last year's release, the John Edwards Kentucky Senator Bourbon. They just aged it an additional year. So the mash bill is 75% corn, 21% rye, and 4% malted barley. Again, we don't really know what went into this. It could be a blend of different bourbons. But we do know that there are approximately 4,000 bottles of this, and the suggested retail price is $119.99. As you know, with each of these releases, they have a historical senator in the state of Kentucky that they honor with the release. They tell you a little bit of their story on the back of the bottle. They say that Jim Bunning was a true Kentucky original. He had an over 17-year Major League Baseball career and earned 9 All-Star selections and pitched a perfect game for the Philadelphia Phillies in 1964. He was inducted into the Baseball Hall of Fame in 1996 and later served 2 terms in the U.S. Senate from 1999 to 2012. Now, what's cool is he is responsible for designating September as National Bourbon Heritage Month. He also is responsible for calling bourbon America's native spirit. That tagline has stuck around since he was in office. That's a really cool contribution. It's something that affects us day to day in the world of whiskey. By the way, this release is available now at select Kentucky retailers, bars, and restaurants, or you can buy it online at Bourbon Outfitter or Kentucky Senator Bourbon. They're also going to be featuring a limited quantity of it at the Jack Rose Dining Saloon in Washington, D.C., and the Premier Drams Bottle Shop. So I encourage you to go check out their website, kysenatorbourbon.com, and read up more about Jim Bunning because he seems like a Kentucky legend. But that's all we really know about the bourbon, so I'm really excited to get it open and give it a review. Now, unfortunately, I don't still have my bottle of last year's release, but it did make my top 10 whiskeys of the year. I do really remember enjoying that one, so I'm excited to see what it tastes like at an extra year older. I'm hoping it brings extra depth to it. I remember I got a lot of heavy oak notes on it, as well as a bit of a tea, even like a black sweet tea note. So I'm excited to see what this has done after an extra year of aging. Let's give it a nose. Oh yeah, still very oaky. I mean, one would expect something that I thought was extremely oaky back, a year ago is going to still be extremely oaky with an extra year of aging. It almost goes a level deeper though. It's not just the oak, it's almost like a bit of a charred piece of maybe like beef. I'm almost thinking like a bit of a beef jerky, like a teriyaki beef jerky kind of nose there. That's kind of a second layer on top of the oak. A little sweet though, and a little bit spicy. Yeah, I'm thinking like Jack's Link beef jerky, which I'm a beef jerky fan. I'm not going to complain about that. Let's go for a taste of this one. Okay. Yeah, doesn't taste like beef jerky, so that's probably a plus for most people. There is a bit of a kind of smoky thing going on. It's like the oak has gone so far that it's kind of a little bit ashy in a way. And that's a note I typically get on something like a scotch, so it's a little bit strange getting on a bourbon. It kind of threw me off with the first sip. It just reminds me of like a freshly put out campfire. So it's a mix of oak and that, char kind of element to it. I will say on the back part of the palate and going into the finish, it does still have some of those black tea notes that I lingered on the number 6 release, but it's way less sweet. I mean, I wouldn't even say sweet tea. I would say this is more of like a unsweetened black tea, but it's kind of subtle. I was hoping a little bit more of those really brilliant, great tea notes that I loved about the past release would show up a bit more. I mean, it's really overshadowed by that kind of ashy smokiness that I'm getting on it. The first thing that I feel like might jump in people's minds to describe something like this is over oaked, but I don't think that's what's happening here. It's not like it has a bitter or a tannic kind of oakiness that I've had on bourbons that I think have been aged too long. I think that extra year of aging has just kind of transformed the palate quite a bit into something that's almost unrecognizable. I love an oaky bourbon and I love a sweet bourbon. This one kind of feels like both are competing, but not in a very distinct way. It's like they're competing in the next room over. You know how people say LaCroix is like someone squirted a lime like 100 feet away from a sparkling water. This is kind of giving that. It's more of a subtle note. I think the main thing here is, unfortunately, the ethanol is kind of kicking up mid palate, and it's kind of overshadowing those notes that I typically enjoy. It just doesn't necessarily feel as well-rounded as I've had in past Kentucky Senator Bourbon releases. And that could just be personal preference. Maybe, someone's preferring this flavor profile. But I think what was released back in release number 6 at 7.5 years was really special. So that extra year changed it enough that I just don't quite vibe with this, if that makes sense. We all know that time in the barrel affects a whiskey greatly. And, you would think going from 7.5 to 8.5 years wouldn't do too much. But clearly, there's a pretty big distinction here from what I remember of the 6th release. And I'll be honest, this isn't a first impression of this one. I actually tried it a couple nights ago, had a similar reaction, and decided to sit on it because, like I said, I've typically loved these in the past. So I wanted to make sure that, maybe it just wasn't my palate on first taste. But I'm kind of getting the same experience here. It's a bit hot in the mid palate, a bit short on the finish. And overall, it just, unfortunately, this release isn't doing it for me. It's not a bad bourbon by any means. It's just lacking quite a bit of sweetness that I usually expect. I'm going to be honest, I always am honest with these reviews, and it does kind of hurt my heart a little bit to say that because I loved the, last year's release, and then a few years back, their whiskey actually was my number 1 whiskey of the year. I think back in 23, 24? I don't remember exactly, but yeah, unfortunately, this release just doesn't quite do it for me. I love the story. I love the packaging. I think price is fine. 8.5 years for 120. That's pretty on par with some of these limited releases. I just think flavor-wise, it's not really my jam. So as always, I'm going to give this a score based on all things considered: availability, price, nose, palate, finish, just my overall opinion of it. It's a fun bottle to collect. It's a once-a-year release. I think it's, if you've had previous releases, maybe try this before you buy it. I just think this one is a little bit different than what I'm used to. So I'm going to have to give this a 4 out of 10, unfortunately. It's just, to me, it's a bit below average. It's not my favorite for the flavor profile, for the price. But again, this doesn't discourage me from enjoying Kentucky Senator releases. I appreciate the fact that they sent me this bottle for review, and I'm always going to give my honest opinion of it. I'm excited for what's next. I just think that this one doesn't quite do it for me in terms of flavor profile. All right, well, thank you all so much for listening. This has been a very insightful episode in terms of news and thoughts and new opinions, but hopefully you all enjoyed it as much as I did. So thank you all for listening. Of course, if you want to leave me a message and a question for a future upcoming episode, you can always call into the Bourbon Bytes hotline. That's 916-642-9837 or 916-64-BYTES. Would love to get your questions and comments and answer them on an upcoming episode. Or if you want to just interact and ask questions on our Discord server, you can go to bourbonbytes.com and find us there. But thank you all so much for listening. This has been the Bourbon Bytes Podcast, a whiskey podcast with a gaming twist. Cheers, and I'll talk to you next episode.